One of the strangest things about Soviet crime is that many citizens lived with fear of events they were barely allowed to read about. Murders, shootings, disappearances, and other serious cases could shake whole communities, yet the official press might stay nearly silent. To understand Soviet crime, you also have to understand the stories the newspapers were built to keep out. Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. The reason so many Soviet crimes never reached the newspapers begins with the structure of Soviet information itself. The Bolsheviks shut down hostile newspapers early and imposed preventive censorship. And by 1922, they had created Glavlit, the Central Censorship Office, with final authority over printed materials and the performing arts. The Soviet press was never meant to operate as an independent watchdog. It was meant to serve the state, protect the state, and manage how reality appeared in public. That meant editors were not simply asking whether something was true. They were also asking whether it was politically safe to print. A Cambridge History of Soviet Journalism notes that serious accidents, natural disasters, and gruesome crimes were especially sensitive topics, which meant reporting on them was often limited or absent altogether. If a case threatened the image of order, competence, or moral superiority, it was exactly the kind of case most likely to be minimized, delayed, or excluded. There was also a deeper ideological reason. In the Soviet system, crime was not only a legal fact, it could also be a political embarrassment. A study in the British Journal of Criminology notes that after the fall of communism, statistics on previously taboo subjects, such as homicide, became available in the Soviet Union for the first time in more than 50 years. That is a remarkable clue. If even homicide statistics could be treated as taboo, then the silence around individual crimes becomes much easier to understand. The state was not only managing fear, it was defending a worldview. One of the clearest examples of this logic is the Novocherkassk massacre of 1962. Workers in the city protested worsening economic conditions, and the crowd was dispersed by gunfire. According to the Soviet History Archive, 24 people were killed, dozens were wounded, and more than 100 people were later convicted, with 7 sentenced to death. The same source says the authorities did their best to suppress the event, and that the first article devoted to Novocherkassk in a Soviet newspaper did not appear until June 1988. In other words, a major act of lethal violence inside the Soviet Union remained effectively outside the legal press for 26 years. The reason is not hard to see. Novocherkassk was not just a local tragedy. It exposed a contradiction the Soviet press was not built to admit. A workers' state had opened fire on workers. If the event had been reported honestly at the time, it would not simply have embarrassed local authorities. It would have raised questions about the legitimacy of the entire system. So the newspapers did not become a channel of public understanding. They became part of the silence. Another example is the Kishtim disaster of 1957 near the secret nuclear complex later known as Mayak. Britannica states that a buried tank of radioactive waste exploded, contaminating about 23,000 square kilometers, forcing the evacuation of more than 10,000 people, and probably causing hundreds of deaths. It also notes that the Soviet government refused to acknowledge the event until 1989. Kishtim was not a conventional crime story, but it reveals the same press logic. When death, danger, and state responsibility converged, the newspaper did not automatically become a warning system. It could become an instrument of concealment instead. The same mechanism shaped criminal investigations too. A powerful example is Andrei Chikatilo. Britannica notes that his case is significant not only because he murdered at least 50 people between 1978 and 1990, but because efforts by Soviet police to warn the public were hampered by official ideology, which asserted that serial murder was impossible in a communist society. Britannica also states that he often approached victims at rail stations and bus depots, and that police recognized a serial pattern. So the problem was not total ignorance. The problem was that public warning lagged behind what investigators were beginning to understand. That matters because newspapers do more than summarize events after the fact. They also help define danger while it is unfolding. If the press cannot clearly name the threat, the public is left with rumor instead of guidance. In the Chikatilo case, disappearances and fear spread through families, transport routes, and neighborhoods, while the official ideological framework made it harder to say openly what kind of offender people were dealing with. Silence did not reduce fear. It made fear less precise and more corrosive. This also helps explain why unofficial information mattered so much in Soviet life. Britannica's entry on Samizdat states that it circulated reports of dissident activities and other news suppressed by official media, along with trial materials and political analysis. That means Soviet citizens themselves understood that important truths might never appear in legal newspapers. If reports had to circulate by hand, through private copying and trusted networks, then absence from the newspaper was not proof that nothing had happened. Often, it suggested the opposite. That created a very specific psychological environment. In a more open media system, a serious crime usually produces a visible public record. In the Soviet system, silence itself became meaningful. People learned to read omission as a sign. If a major case did not appear in print, that might mean it was politically sensitive, institutionally embarrassing, or ideologically inconvenient. The newspaper did not simply shape what people knew. It shaped how they interpreted not knowing. And that may be one of the most important things to understand about Soviet fear. It often grew in the space between what people sensed and what the press refused to confirm. It is also worth saying that not every unreported Soviet crime was hidden for exactly the same reason. Some cases were suppressed because they exposed state violence. Some because they revealed institutional failure. Some because they contradicted the ideological claim that socialism was creating a more orderly and morally advanced society. And some because local and central officials feared scandal. But the effect was often the same. Serious crime looked rarer, more isolated, or less socially revealing than it really was. The public received a narrowed version of reality. That tells us something larger about Soviet society. A state can censor information to preserve calm, but it can also produce a deeper, stranger kind of anxiety in the process. When newspapers leave out too much, citizens do not become fearless. They become dependent on whispers, private memory, unofficial channels, and incomplete fragments. Trust weakens in two directions at once. People trust the press less, and they trust the world around them less as well. The official silence that was supposed to maintain order can end up quietly undermining it. That is why this subject matters beyond media history. It is really a story about how societies perceive danger. When crime reporting is open, citizens can at least respond to facts. When crime reporting is filtered through ideology, institutional fear, and censorship, danger becomes harder to measure and easier to misread. Soviet citizens did not simply live with less information. They lived inside a system where absence was often the message. In the end, so many Soviet crimes never reached the newspapers because Soviet newspapers were never meant to expose reality at any cost. They were meant to manage it. Protecting the image of the state often mattered more than documenting the full truth of a murder, a disappearance, a shooting, or a disaster. That is why the topic still matters now. What the public did not read was often not empty space. It was evidence of a struggle between truth and power. And for long stretches of Soviet history, power decided what the page would not say. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.